All right, and I'm just going to run through some of the most common things that we'll see like in these complaint letters in general, the main key items you want to make sure you're accessible with on your website. So this is w3.org. This is kind of a guide that you can find descriptions of all of the guidelines. And you can see here, this is just a quick view of all of the guidelines that are listed in accessibility requirements. It's a very long list, and a lot of it is very technical. Some of it is more easy to understand, but it's just a good guide so you can see all the different things in here, like headings and labels, page titles, bypass, blocks. A lot of it takes a long time to fully understand what everything actually means. Some of it is you need to be a developer and be able to build that into the framework of the website. Some of it is as simple as making sure images have alt text and the colors meet minimum contrast levels. So if you look at this guide, you can see all these different advisory techniques, and then they'll have examples of failures. This is kind of just a quick overview just to show you how many different things go into having an accessible website, and going through all these is important just to avoid any issues with these demand letters and everything. So I'm going to run through the key items. So starting off, the most basic thing that is important is alt text for images. So basically any image on a website needs to have alt text for anyone who is blind or visually impaired and they cannot see the image. You need to have essentially a description of what that image is. So when they're using screen readers and they hover over it, or the screen reader gets to that, it describes what the image is. And so you can see here, right now it just looks like an image, but if you look at the code, there is a little alt here. So this is outside of Sterling Insurance Agency offices. So that is what the screen reader would read to anyone who cannot actually see the image. So that is probably the number one thing we find is with screen readers. So they don't know what an image is, or the complaint is they don't know where a link is going to. So that's kind of the key item with images. So going down here, basically all images on the site need to have alt text. And another item, starting off with some visual items, is hover effects. So links need to be very clear that they are links. So if we just have this, our history link, and we hover over it, if we only had a fade or color change or something like that, that isn't accessible for people who are visually impaired. If they're colorblind, they might not be able to see a color change. So you need to have more than just a color change or like a fade. You need to have, generally the best bet is to have this underline on hover. So on buttons and everything, there should be some sort of underline that makes it clear to anyone with any disability that is a link. A couple more items, just a quick thing, your website, if you do a test on your site, you need to be able to zoom in up to 200%, and the website needs to be able to respond to that. And you can see it does here. You can't lose any functionality. So people who need to zoom in for larger text can read everything. And another one is if you zoom up to 400%, basically you need to be able to just scroll down. The wording is you can't have scrolling basically left to right. So as long as the user can zoom in to 400% and just scroll down your site and be able to read all the text without having to scroll back and forth left and right, then you meet the requirements. If not, it could be a flaw with the theme or how the website is built, and that needs to be fixed. And then another item for appearance is color contrast. So there are a couple different levels of color contrast. So I have this contrast checker that you can Google and find this tool. And you can see here, we have the WCAG AA, which is generally what you want to follow. AAA is the next level of accessibility, but their items are known just to basically be impossible to fully meet. So AA is essentially the highest level of accessibility you can meet with a functional website. So you can see here, this color contrast ratio is 4.46 to 1, which is this red link on white text. So if text needs to be 4.5 to 1. So technically this would fail if the text was just small. But if text is larger, like a heading, or if the text is bolded, then you meet a lower contrast ratio. So see here, large text, which is bold, or larger text, it passes. And if it wasn't bolded text, it would fail. So you can check for links here. So essentially when we went through the site, we had to make sure all links were bolded so it would meet this color contrast requirement. And you can test all different color contrasts. You can see there's a lot of different, we have basically gray on white, red on white, and then up here we have a gray background. So all the colors would need to meet these requirements. Since there's so many different items, you can also use some Google extensions, which will test the whole website or the page that you're on and let you know where that color contrast is failing. So that's what we have for appearance and content. Then we have some usability things. So if you have video on your website, you need to have alternatives for people who can't see. So if they can't see the video, you need to have either an audio only file available for them to listen to, or the best bet is just to have a transcript of all videos available. So a screen reader can just read all of the text or the whole transcript that it happens in the video. And then you'll see there are some other items in here, like time-based media if you have audio only, and then for pre-recorded or live video, you need to have captions. And so there are some other requirements depending on what kind of media it is, but in general, you need to have either audio or video. You need to have more than one type of media available depending on the disability. Also for usability, you need to be able to, a lot of people use tabs to navigate a website. If they can't use a mouse, they will tab like this through the site. And your website needs to be fully functional. A big common thing we see is if you start tabbing and you hit the submenus, the submenu won't open when using tabs. So that's like an example of how it wouldn't work. So this is working perfectly. I can tab through the site and it's bringing me down the page as I go. So this is how your website should work. If you're on your site and you're tabbing around and you're not seeing everything clearly outlined like this, then your website isn't accessible for keyboard navigation. And you can see the outlines here is something that is controlled in the style sheet of website. So a lot of themes override that since it's not very pretty. But it is necessary to make sure your website is fully accessible. And just to show a couple other kind of hidden things, you can see these links up here, skip to navigation, skip to content. This is kind of a usability thing for people who are using the tabs. So if I was going around the website, it would be annoying every time to tab through the entire navigation item to get down the page. So these skip links are added so they can just skip to the content and it'll go over these links so they don't have to go over the links every single time. So testing to make sure everything works with the keyboard is a big thing. So the main things you need to worry about are screen readers and essentially keyboard users. The biggest kind of most difficult element to make accessible are sliders like this. So a lot of sliders generally are not accessible. If you have content that is changing on every slide, then you need to make sure that people have enough time to read it. So the safety net there is basically you need to have if you're auto scrolling, you would need to have a play or pause or a way for someone to stop that slider from advancing. In this case, this is just static content over it, and then the graphic is really just decorative. So the content isn't changing on the slide, so it isn't necessary to have the pause and play kind of functionality here. We do have arrows to control where everyone goes. And if you do have these arrows, you just need to make sure that you can control these with your keyboard, basically be able to navigate to those arrows and switch slides without just using a mouse to click on them. Also having some sliders will allow you to make it so people can switch slides just using the arrows on their keyboard if they're selecting that. That's another way to make sure it's accessible. And then the final thing is just to make sure the images in the slideshow also have readable alt text. That is another big thing, since these slide images sometimes are added in the style sheet as kind of like a background image. The alt text won't be readable, so you kind of need to rework it so screen readers can read that alt text and read the image to the user. A couple final items for the biggest pieces are there needs to be multiple ways for a user to get to every single page on your website. So the first one would generally be the navigation. So that's one way that everyone can get to it. Then the second way, the most common, would be either a search box, allowing people to search for something on your site. So that's a second way that they can get to it. Or you can add a sitemap. That is a second way. You can just have all your pages listed there so they can get to your content through the main navigation or the sitemap. Then every website needs an accessibility statement. So this basically just confirms that you have tried to make the website as accessible as possible. It's nearly impossible to have a fully accessible website. A lot of items you can actually kind of ignore or kind of bypass or add to your accessibility statement if it is essential to your website. So if you have a slider that's auto scrolling and you feel it's essential that it auto scrolls on a certain time for whatever reason, then you don't need to modify that as long as the functionality is completely essential to the site. And just as a disclaimer here, you basically just want to list any known issues. There might be some color contrast issues on the site that you know about. You want to list them here. And then you want to welcome your users to contact you if they're having any difficulty with your website, and give them an email address to contact you.
One thing to ask is one of the participants has asked if you have third-party videos on your site that aren't ADA compliant. Like putting a YouTube video in a blog post or something like that. Would the idea then to probably be to add that into your accessibility statements, saying that we may have third-party videos on our website that aren't compliant? We're, working on fixing that, or what do you think would be the way to go about that?
Yeah, I would say to just add that to your accessibility statement. It is a third party, so you don't have full control over everything that it could be. If you can add a transcript about that video to it, that would be even better. But in that case, you wouldn't be able to do too much, and you don't just want to get rid of the video because it's not completely accessible. Then that would be something that would be essential. You would want to add that to your accessibility statement.
Okay.
And then the final thing here is this tool. Just wanted to highlight. It's from UserWay, and it is a tool basically made for people who have disabilities to be able to modify the website so they can make text bigger. They can increase the text spacing. Is it dyslexia friendly? They can pause animations, which will essentially pause slideshows or pause things that are moving for them. You can highlight all the links to make it clear which links there are. Change the color contrast for anyone depending on what their vision issue is. And then there's screen readers built into it, and you can view the page structure, which is kind of outlines the page. So this is another thing in the accessibility that's kind of more developer related. There's landmarks you can add to the website to basically identify where the header is, where the main content is, and where the footer is. So those are called ARIA landmarks, and there's a lot of other things you can do with those. Those are more built for accessibility. So your website should have this built-in structure with the correct landmarks. So screen readers can know where the main content is, where the header is, where the footer is. So that's just another piece of the accessibility. And adding this is has like, they also have scanners you can use. This is a free widget you can add. They can give you an accessibility statement as well. And this is actually used by the nonprofits that have been sending out demand letters. So they use the same tool, and it won't make your website fully accessible just because there's so many different guidelines you need to meet, especially when it comes to depending on what your content is on your site. But it definitely helps and shows you're trying to make your website as accessible as possible.
Yeah. So there's a question here. What about side scrolling that are completely controlled by the user? They click on arrows to move to the next slide. So that sounds like that would be accessible because they're. I guess as long as it's connected, as long as you can scroll using a keyboard too, as well as the clicking on the
Yeah,
arrows.
as long as everyone can um, control it. You don't need a mouse. You could use a keyboard to control it. And then like a smaller thing you need to just check for is to make sure if you start tabbing through it, it doesn't keep you in an endless loop. Some elements can do that. Like basically we had to rebuild this services thing which scrolls, because before it was using arrows and it would just be an infinite loop, and if someone started tabbing through it, it would just take them back to the beginning, especially with screen readers, and they could never get down the page. So with scrolling items, you want to make sure you can control with keyboards, um, and it's not an infinite loop. That's called a keyboard trap in accessibility. Essentially, once you get into that loop, you can't get out. So that's another item that needs to be avoided.
So next question is for the average website of 10 or so things discussed, is there 3 or 4 that are absolute musts? So so just saying like if you weren't going to do everything, they're the most important things. It seems like with accessibility, it is mostly just a demonstrated effort to be accessible is partly what makes you compliant. So if there were a top, you know, a minimum bare amount of things you could do, what they would be.
So the bare minimum, I would say you would want to add this widget, which would take care of a lot of items with bigger text and pausing animations and changing contrast colors. So that would be one. Then the thing this can't do is add alt text images. So adding alt text would be the next biggest item. And then from there, I would just say making sure you have like the skip links enabled, which need to be added usually through a plugin or manually. And then probably just making sure there's no like keyboard traps, or if you have video, just have alternatives or add that to your accessibility statement.
Mm-hmm. All right. Another question, would you recommend working with a company to do this, like Accessible or Equal Web? Is it worth the value? So for that question, I'm not familiar with either of those companies. From what we've seen, I mean, we specialize in building websites, and took a lot of time to understand the guidelines and implement everything to be accessible. So I don't know if you necessarily have to have one of those companies do it, but it definitely wouldn't hurt to look into it if the cost isn't too high. But it seems like you can either do it yourself or hire a company like ours to go through and take the necessary steps to make the website compliant. What I did see with another company, but their costs were just crazy expensive, was more so like setting you up with some kind of software that helps you keep a log of everything you've done to make the website accessible. And that's a really good tool to have, where if there was a lawsuit or somebody's trying to sue the organization, you could have this third party log saying like, here's everything we did to stay accessible, and they could send that and dispute and probably win. So that's one advantage to that. But we're doing that for one of our other clients where we're on a scheduled basis going in and making improvements to the ADA compliance over time, and just keeping a separate document of everything that was done so that they also have that history. Because it seems like that's the toughest thing with the ADA compliance is, it's not like you're getting your certification and it's valid for a year. It's kind of something that needs to always be improved, and people can always try to nitpick or just dispute it. But as long, it's really important just to show that you're taking it seriously and doing what you can within reason to accommodate and be accessible. I don't know if you've read about any of those companies, Garrett, or what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I would say just make it clear that you're making an effort to be accessible and work on those key areas, like just making sure you have alt text as you add images ongoing. Just make sure you always add alt text, and um, yeah, mainly those few things. A few of the demand letters we've seen, there's a lot of the issues with like those landmarks and all the smaller items that are kind of hidden in the back end, but the demand letters have been focusing mainly on alt text or knowing what a link is when hovering over with a screen reader. So it's kind of those bigger items that go through the website once, make sure all the links and images have alt text, and then on an ongoing basis, make sure you're always making sure links are clear and images have alt text so screen readers can read them.
Mm-hmm. All right. Another question is in a relationship between GDPR compliance, or is it only EU? I don't think the ADAs. I don't think they're related, right, Garrett, between the privacy and the ADA.
No, since I mean GDPR was more for the EU and the accessibility requirements was a bill passed in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And it's not privacy related necessarily.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of a separate task.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that'll be a future webinar. We haven't heard a lot about that, but that was pretty big when that first passed with the GDPR and the EU and all those things that were going on. All right, so let's see. That's all the questions that were posed so far. And we'll just give another minute. Anybody else want to add in any questions? Please feel free to do so over the next minute or so. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping it up. And we did record the webinar, so I'm going to send that out to everyone so you can rewatch it. I know the technical part was really exciting, and I will be following up with that. And also, with Garrett mentioned a few links over the course of this, so I'm going to send those links out too, so that so you can find them. These two, and then probably that Chrome extension that Garrett mentioned. And I think you use a WordPress plugin, Garrett. If you have WordPress, you can probably send that a link to that plugin over so you can check it out. And yeah, so those are the follow-up items, and then we're pretty much just going to go through any other QA questions that come up, and then we'll wrap up shortly here, so we can all get back to our busy days working at home. All right. So John asked, where do we find the standards? So I'll send that link. I'll answer this. I'll send that link out, but it is w3.org, right, Garrett?
Yeah. And then they have other tools on there. You can just scroll through. We'll send the direct link to the guidelines here for the latest version.
All right. Another question is, how much time do we have to become compliant? Well, it's something you can do anytime, proactively. If you receive one of those letters over the last week or two, then what it stipulated was you had to respond within 10 days and they had 30 days to resolve. But there was some association of the Massachusetts that has represents insurance agencies. It's like a member organization, and their advice based on their own counsel and stuff like that said that you should not respond to that letter, but you should hire a developer or do it yourself to make your website compliant. So in terms of how long do you have, just probably do it sooner than later. But in terms of that letter, from what I've read, you want to consult your own attorney most likely. But from what I read and what I've heard, you don't have to respond to that letter, but you should just go ahead and do what you can to become accessible anyway in the meantime, to avoid problems with it in the future. All right, next question. Can we talk about how we can hire you? Yeah, so this is one of the agencies that got that letter that pretty much every company got last week. And what we did was we actually had originally built the site. ADA compliance wasn't really a concern for these types of sites, and typically wouldn't be. But since they got the letter, we did go through, and they basically just hired us. We looked at the site and gave them an estimate on what it would take to get it done, and it was fairly low cost, and was able to take care of it for them within a week. All right. So next one, will you typically get a warning about compliance before getting sued? I don't really know, to be honest. And the one that got sent out last week and the week before was more of just like, it was a pretty good scenario where it's like, somebody, they send a thing and they say, hey, you have 10 days to let us know you got it, and then 30 days to resolve. So that's kind of a good deal, but I don't know how it's worked in the past. I know that there has been actual lawsuits that aren't kind of just that scammy one that went out last week. And I'm not sure how those worked, or if it was more of a warning, and then if they failed to resolve it, then it became a lawsuit. So I'm not too sure how those played out, but I do know that these ADA complaints and lawsuits are only becoming more common, and now it's funneling down to small businesses. I think more so because a lot of the companies that were getting targeted before were hospitals and credit unions, basically places that could afford to pay these settlements. And I think all those sites have been kind of like, at this point, becoming accessible. So now they're kind of working their way down the chain to smaller businesses and trying to target them for their settlements and stuff like that. So that's just my own theory. Do you have a boilerplate ADA compliant text? We have we've kind of come up with this accessibility statement, so maybe I could send that over in terms of boilerplate language in terms of what can be added to a site. And can an existing website be tweaked if you're hired? Yeah, so we've done 2 now, and we have 2 more to go, and those are all existing websites that we're making ADA compliant, so that's perfectly fine for us to be able to do. All right, there's a chat in here. Thanks. Yeah, so no problem on that. I think if you haven't gotten a complaint or a letter, at this point, it's more just a, proactive thing to do versus, probably better just to get it done instead of waiting to get some kind of complaint or letter. And it's on these other sites that we've been doing, it's only taken about 5 or 6 hours to go through and follow the guidelines. So it's the type of thing where you can hire somebody to do it pretty quick and efficiently and be in a better position than if there was no work done. All right, so that looks like all the questions. Thanks everyone for attending today. We'll be sending out all the follow-up information hopefully by the end of the week with the recording. And thanks, Garrett, for walking us all through it. I know how much you enjoy doing these compliance things, and next time we get you on it, we'll get you with a webcam.
Yeah. All right.
All right, have a great day, everyone. Thanks.